For centuries, we've been told the Greeks did not invent their own writing system. Instead, they are said to have borrowed it from a Semitic people from the Levant they called the Phoenicians. According to this narrative, sometime around the 8th century BCE, Greeks encountered Phoenician merchants in the eastern Mediterranean and adopted their consonantal writing system. Interestingly, this Phoenician script used no vowels, instead having speakers assume the vowels simply by looking at the consonants. The Greeks took the script, but modified it and added vowels. As their language is too vowel-specific, it will make it impossible to use the script just as it was. This borrowed alphabet emerged the writing system that eventually gave rise to Latin and the alphabets of the modern Western world. This is the mainstream narrative you will find in all university classics departments across the globe. But is it even true? What if this mainstream version of history rests on a large misunderstanding, or even a chain of misunderstandings, repeated so often that it became hardened into historical fact? In this video, we are going to explore this very real and very controversial possibility, that the story of the Greeks borrowing their alphabet from the Phoenicians may be a historical reconstruction built on extremely fragile foundations. A reconstruction, in fact, that was shaped by the interpretation of a single ancient historian and locked into mainstream academia by the domineering religious assumptions of medieval and early modern Europe. This video will also dive one step further and pose an even more controversial question. What if the people we now call Phoenicians were not always a separate, distinct civilization of the Mediterranean as we imagine them to be? What if, in their earliest stages, the maritime trading cities of the Levant, known collectively as Phoenicia, were populated by peoples who, for the most part, were ethnically, culturally, and linguistically Greek and not Semitic? What if their Semitic characteristics and Semitic language was actually a later development, a consequence of absorbing the Semitic culture and language of the inland people they originally traded with? These what-ifs form the bulk of the Phoenician deception. Surprisingly, much of it traces back to a single ancient author, the ancient historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE. In his writings Histories, Herodotus tells the story about the legendary figure Cadmus, who supposedly came to Greece from Phoenicia and introduced writing. In describing this historical origin myth, Herodotus refers to a particular phrase that seems to be part of the commonly transmitted mythic narrative. The phrase is Phoenicia grammata. For centuries, this phrase has been translated as Phoenician letters. But here's the problem. Herodotus' explanation of what Phoenicia grammata meant was only one interpretation among several that existed in antiquity. Of interest is the observation of Jean Schneider that it is surprising that the first surviving account at our disposal of the Cadmus myth, namely that of Stesichorus, a Greek poet who lived over 100 years before Herodotus, does not mention the Phoenician background of the Greek alphabet at all. If one accepts the conventional model according to which the Phoenicians introduced the alphabet to Greece in the early 8th century, this would have been a relatively recent event, and one might expect some reference to it. By contrast, all accounts, without exception, place the invention of writing much earlier, in the distant legendary past. The main issue here is the Greek word phoenix is remarkably ambiguous. In ancient Greek, it can refer to several completely different things, including, number 1, a Phoenician person, number 2, a palm tree, and number 3, something reddish or crimson in color. Because of this ambiguity, ancient scholars themselves offered multiple explanations for the phrase. Some said the letters were called Phoenicia because they came from the Phoenicians. Others suggested the name referred to the red color of early writing pigments. But another explanation is that the phrase originally referred to palm leaves used as writing tablets. In this last interpretation, Phoenicia grammata could mean something closer to palm leaf writings. This idea may sound strange at first, but it actually fits surprisingly well with what we know about writing in the Bronze Age Aegean world. The earliest Greek writing system, Linear B, was used in the Mycenaean palaces between roughly 1400 and 1200 BCE. Thousands of Linear B tablets survive today, but they are all written on clay. Clay tablets are not very convenient writing materials. In ancient societies, clay tablets were mainly used for archival records, not for ordinary writing, given their durability. Many scholars believe the Mycenaean scribes must have also written on perishable materials, such as wooden tablets, wax tablets, leather, or possibly plant materials like palm leaves. Those materials would almost never survive archaeologically. Only the clay tablets, accidentally preserved by the fires that destroyed the Mycenaean palaces, could remain. The theory proposed in the Journal of Hellenic Studies suggests that the phrase Phoenikaia grammata may originally have referred to exactly this kind of writing, describing the medium of writing and not its ethnic origin. Over time, however, the original meaning may have been forgotten. When Herodotus encountered the phrase Phoenikaia grammata, he interpreted the ambiguous word phonics as referring to Phoenicians rather than palm leaves, and cast Cadmus, the legendary figure, as a Phoenician to help explain this. The palm leaf interpretation also seems to clarify some aspects of history that otherwise would make little sense if Herodotus was correct. For example, the assumption that Phoenikaia grammata refers to Linear B explains why this expression is so strongly tied to the heroic age, the time attributed to Cadmus, which is usually situated in the Bronze Age, a time much further back in Greek history. The interpretation Phoenikaia grammata as referring to palm leaf letters is also preferable from a semantic point of view. It is quite natural that terminology for writing should be connected to writing materials, whereas the use of a foreign ethnicon to refer to this activity would seem unusual. Given this, it seems extremely likely that Herodotus' account is a learned reinterpretation, a scholarly guess that latched onto the wrong sense of an ambiguous word and thereby manufactured a Phoenician transmission narrative that later authors inherited. One of the strangest aspects of the Cadmus story is how comfortably he fits into the fabric of Greek mythology itself. In the earliest traditions, Cadmus is not portrayed as an outsider bringing a foreign culture into Greece at all. In fact, he slays dragons, founds the city of Thebes, and becomes the ancestor of one of the most famous royal houses in Greek myth, the line that eventually leads to Oedipus. Nothing about this story suggests the arrival of a foreign civilization, nor is that cultural clash even mentioned. Phoenician is supposedly a Semitic language, so shouldn't the people of Thebes be speaking Phoenician? Meanwhile, Cadmus behaves exactly like other Greek mythological founders, such as Cecrops of Athens or Danaus of Argos. Even more striking is the fact that several figures who are later described as Phoenician appear throughout Greek mythology in ways that do not mark them as foreigners at all. Cadmus's own family illustrates this perfectly. His sister Europa becomes one of the most central figures in Greek myth after Zeus carries her to Crete, where she becomes the mother of Minos, the legendary king of Crete and ruler of the Minoan world. From this union comes the entire mythological cycle of Crete, the Minotaur, the Labyrinth, and the rise of one of the most important Bronze Age civilizations in the Greek imagination. Yet Europa is not treated as an exotic outsider. She becomes integrated directly into the genealogy of Greek kings. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Cadmus's brother, Phoenix, is said to have given his name to Phoenicia itself. His father, Agenor, appears as a king in the mythic genealogies. His descendants become woven into the heroic traditions of Greece. These characters move through Greek myth not as foreign intruders, but as participants in the same mythological world as Perseus, Heracles, and Theseus. In fact, many ancient writers did not emphasize any Near Eastern origin for Cadmus at all. Some traditions connect him to Argive lineages through the heroine Io, while others place him entirely within Greek mythological genealogies. As the classical archaeologist Emily Vermeuil observed, it appears that there is no early connection, in the Greek mind at least, between Cadmus and the Near East. This observation becomes even more intriguing when we consider the conclusions of historian Frederick All. all noted that attempts to reconcile the literary tradition of Cadmus with the archaeological evidence have become increasingly difficult. The traditional picture of a Phoenician Cadmus introducing alphabetic writing into Greece faces chronological, archaeological, and epigraphic problems. As a result, all argue that the possibility of a Mycenaean Cadmus deserves more serious consideration. His proposal is quite striking. Rather than viewing Cadmus as a Levantine bringer of the alphabet, all suggested that Cadmus may originally have been remembered as a figure from the Mycenaean world itself. In that reconstruction, the writing associated with Cadmus was not a foreign Semitic alphabet, but rather Linear B, the script used to write Mycenaean Greek centuries before the appearance of the classical Greek alphabet after the Greek Dark Ages. Via All's theory, Cadmus was not a Phoenician, but rather a hero of the Greek heroic age associated with the arrival of writing into the Aegean world. Another piece of evidence that breaks the Phoenician transmission myth comes from the earliest Greek tragedians themselves. Consider Aeschylus, born around 525 BCE. If the traditional story were true, we might expect one of Greece's earliest playwrights to treat Cadmus and the Phoenicians as foreigners. But Aeschylus does not. In 7 Against Thebes, the city founded by Cadmus is repeatedly presented as part of Greece itself. Eteocles prays to Zeus that Thebes may never be destroyed and asks the gods to preserve it. He asks to preserve the clear voice of Greece, which includes, in his list of representations, the free land of Cadmus. The implication is striking. The land of Cadmus is not contrasted with Greece. It is Greece. The language spoken there is described as the language of Hellas itself. There is no sense here that Thebes represents some foreign colony or Levantine transplant. Cadmus's city is portrayed as fully integrated into the Greek world. Even more revealing is the way Aeschylus treats the broader family of Cadmus. The Cadmean dynasty is not depicted as alien or exotic. It occupies the center of Greek heroic mythology. Cadmus founds Thebes. His descendants include Semele, mother of Dionysus. Through his line emerged some of the most famous figures in Greek legend. The entire Theban cycle, one of the foundational mythological traditions of Greece, rests upon the house of Cadmus. But Aeschylus is not alone. In Euripides' Phoenicae, the chorus repeatedly emphasizes the kinship between the Phoenicians and the Greeks. At one point, the chorus declares, "For the griefs of kin are shared, and shared too, should this 7-towered land suffer anything by the land of Phoenicia. Alas, alas, our blood is one our lineage, we who are sprung from the horned Io, and in her toils I too have my portion." This is not the language of ethnic separation. It is the language of shared ancestry. The descendants of Cadmus, Europa, and Io are portrayed as members of the same mythological family. The phrase common blood appears repeatedly in the play's logic. The conflict at Thebes is tragic precisely because it is a conflict between kin. Elsewhere, Euripides has the chorus lament the suffering of Thebes while speaking as though the fate of Phoenicia and Greece are inseparable. If the land suffers ruin or disaster, the Phoenician too feels the same pain. Again, whatever distinctions may have existed, the playwright is not drawing a sharp civilizational line between Greeks and Phoenicians. In fact, he seems to treat them as the same. According to Diodorus, Cadmus is initiated into the ancient mysteries and marries Harmonia in a wedding attended by the gods themselves. Taken together, these traditions create a striking impression. Euripides seems to still make no clear indication that Cadmus, despite mentioning that he comes from the Phoenician city of Tyre, is anything but Greek, begging the very question, what exactly did the ethnicon Phoenician even mean to these early playwrights? Because it didn't seem to mean a foreign Semitic civilization. If the Phoenicians were the civilization that gave writing to the Greeks, we might expect to find a large body of Phoenician Semitic literature. After all, when writing systems appear in other ancient civilizations, they tend to produce written traditions almost immediately. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets record myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh. In Egypt, hieroglyphic writing produced religious texts, historical records, literature, and monumental inscriptions. In Greece, once the alphabet allegedly appears in the 8th century BCE, we quickly encounter the monumental works of Homer. Writing generates literature, and literature leaves traces. But when we turn to the Phoenicians, no Phoenician literature survives. There are no surviving Phoenician epics at all, no philosophical treatises, no dramatic or religious works. In fact, the only Semitic Phoenician writing that we have of any significant length, such as the Azitawada inscription, is little more than a commemorative plaque. The closest thing we have to attested Phoenician historical texts comes from a figure known as Sanchuniathon, who supposedly wrote a history of Phoenicia in antiquity. But the original work does not survive. It is known only through a Greek author named Philo of Byblos. Some historians even argue Philo invented Sanchuniathon as a means of giving his own claims some form of ancient legitimacy. In other words, perhaps Sanchuniathon and his book never existed. Either way, we have no proof of it at all. If the Phoenicians were the great transmitters of alphabetic writing across the Mediterranean, why do we possess no evidence of their own literary tradition? Another of the most frequently repeated arguments for a Phoenician origin of the Greek alphabet concerns the names of the letters themselves. Alpha resembles Aleph, Beta resembles Beth, Gamma resembles Gimel, and Delta resembles Daleth. Modern textbooks often go a step further and tell us that these words originally meant things such as ox, house, camel, and door, supposedly preserving the memory of an ancient Phoenician alphabet whose letters were named after objects. At first glance, this appears to be a powerful piece of evidence. However, the famed Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, writing in The Formation of the Alphabet in 1912, argued that the traditional Phoenician explanations for the letter names were themselves probably late inventions. Petrie observed that the alleged meanings of the Phoenician letter names often fit only the later Phoenician forms of the signs, and not their earlier forms. In his view, the names functioned more like mnemonic nicknames than original meanings. If Petrie was correct, then one of the most commonly cited pieces of evidence for the Phoenician origin of the alphabet becomes much less certain. The names may indeed be ancient, but the Semitic meanings attached to those names may not be. They may represent a later folk explanation, imposed after the original significance of the symbols had already been forgotten. And if the traditional meanings of the letter names are secondary developments, then we are forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The original meanings behind alpha, beta, gamma, and their predecessors may not have stemmed from a Semitic language at all. So, why has the Greeks owe their language to the Phoenicians' misinterpretation survived for so long? Why does it still stand today? Two possible reasons. The first is simple inertia. The narrative has been embedded in the field for so long that it is genuinely hard to pry loose. The misreading goes back to Herodotus at least in the 5th century BCE, well before the rise of Christianity and even likely before the rise of Judaism. Overturning it now would demand a fundamental philological and paleographic rethinking. The second reason, and probably the more decisive, is a long-standing bias towards locating the origin of writing in the Middle East and the wider Levantine world, and specifically in a Semitic script. That preference suits Abrahamic religious commitments, which would rather see the biblical languages, chiefly Hebrew, a language extremely similar to Phoenician, as the world's original, divinely given tongues, as Scripture implies them to be. For centuries, knowledge of Middle Eastern antiquity reached the modern West through Christian-mediated sources, and it carried that bias with it, a habit of downplaying ancient Greece and the pagan world while elevating the world of the Bible. in summary. It would appear that Cadmus was a hero of the heroic Bronze Age, not of a time near the supposed introduction of a Phoenician alphabet in or around 800 BCE. It would also appear Cadmus would only be portrayed as Phoenician in later times, and even then, no distinction was made that this Phoenician Cadmus was anything more than Greek. Given this, it would make far more sense that the Cadmus myth was at one point reinterpreted, and that its original rendition did not tell the tale of a Semitic Phoenician, but rather of a Hellenic Bronze Age founder.